Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the opening plenary at Urban Arc this year. This is the first of two of our plenaries. Um, I'm very excited. I'm Neha Sami. I anchor the research program here at IIHS, and I'm also with the School of Environment and Sustainability. And I'm very excited to be moderating the panel we have today. I'm really looking forward to it. We have three very exciting speakers. As Lalitha Kamath, Professor and Chairperson, Center for Urban Policy and Governance, the School of Habitat Studies at TIS Mumbai. Jahnavi Phalkey, founding director of the Science Gallery, Bangalore, and Jagdish Krishnaswamy, dean of the IIHS School of Environment and Sustainability. So each of the panelists, we're structuring it much more as a conversation. We're not really presenting, not using slides and things. So each of the panelists will open with a brief discussion. And with a on a statement, and then we'll kind of engage a little bit with the panel, open it up for questions. So as we're speaking, I'd encourage all of you to please sort of keep a running log of questions that you might have, because we'd like for this to really be an interactive session. And what we'd like very much is to focus on how we think about interdisciplinarity, how we think about that in our research, in our practice, in the ways in which we disseminate our work. And so, if I could request each of our panelists to start a little bit by sort of talking for a little bit on their position on the question of what they think of as interdisciplinarity from their own perspectives, either from their own research, their practice, or their pedagogy. And then sort of we'll maybe start with you, Lalita, and then go down to Janvi and then Jagdish.
Thank you so much, Neha, for the introduction to the panel and also for the invitation to be here. Um, Thanks all of you for hanging around, I think, till this late, though I've been told that the online folks are still joining, and it's given the different time zones, it's kind of cool to actually have people tuning in at different points of the day. Just to get started, I think so. I'm going to talk a little bit from my own practice, as well as both research as well as teaching within the Center for Urban Policy and Governance, which is the center where I'm located and where we run a master's program. And I contribute also to other interdisciplinary programs, master's programs in the school. So we were quite early on, and I'm talking about 15 years ago when we began our set of master's programs. We were quite convinced actually of the need for more interdisciplinarity. Many of us who came together to found the school and to contribute to the particular programs within had been struggling for a long time, I think, with issues of silos, disciplinary silos, particularly when you work in the urban and you think about cities, you think about urbanization processes. And I think just a very quick listen onto any of the panels is today really reveal, I think, the breadth of different disciplines that are involved, the kinds of expertise, the kinds of skills. And so we were quite convinced of the need, in fact, to work together to even in this educational, in this pedagogical project of creating a program and a school that focuses on an interdisciplinary way of understanding the urban, and the urban conceived quite broadly. Also, given the highly unequal kind of cities that we work in, the ways in which different marginalized social groups, informal settlements, bastis are represented in extremely problematic ways or left out altogether of, I think, both the practice part of it. So, for example, planning and design and policy discourse, but also knowledge production. I think the way in which it's framed, it's conceived in highly limited, reductionist, downright discriminatory, racist ways. I think all of these really made us feel that what we really need to do is broaden, widen, and sort of do this in a collective way. Additionally, we came together really to think about master students, when they come to us, they're all interested in knowledge and acquiring knowledge, in acquiring skills, but they also want to really think about the real world problems that we all face, wicked problems that are very interconnected, interdisciplinary. And so we are thinking then about a pedagogical practice that has to straddle, I think, both worlds of knowledge production for those who want to go on and do research and to produce further knowledge, but also those who produce knowledge that directly informs and builds policy solutions, governance solutions, planning solutions. So, and given that existing solutions very often harm particular groups, often in the name of, in fact, trying to resolve a particular problem. So I think that was also something that we were quite sure that we didn't want to limit the work of, for example, I'm trained as a planner. I always was quite sure that I didn't want to limit planning only to those who were trained as urban planners. So I think this was this was something that, and when we were thinking about how do we think about teaching and pedagogy, it's none of us are trained, in fact, to be interdisciplinary. And so it really was at some point when we were thinking about what do we need to do in order to embark on this project of, education, of creating a program for master students, we spent quite a lot of time on thinking about that we need something in common. We need to build some kind of a commons that can bring all of them together, because we get very diverse students from a range of not just disciplines, but also geographies, backgrounds, experience sets, pretty much, different worlds. So we spent quite a lot thinking about the commons that we need to bring to create then some kind of way that they can all think from the same space, given they also have very different disciplines. But I think one of the first things of quite early on, it occurred to us, or we really learned rather, that this is also about then a task of unlearning. And more than unlearning, in fact, of unthinking, of undoing the way that we have been taught to think. Because we have been in many ways taught to think in our disciplines, in our disciplinary doctrines, our methodologies, our expertise is very much framed. Our entire systems and structures of promotion, of career, all of these are based on sticking quite closely to these disciplinary boundaries. And so in many ways, it was this task of also unthinking. And that's, I think, something that I had not spent enough time thinking about, and then subsequently in future years. So I want to just touch on a few things that I found useful in this task of sort of both the unthinking part, but then also then the rethinking or the relearning. So one important thing that I've really focused on in the last few years is really thinking about increasingly then how can a pedagogy accommodate boundary blurring phenomena, and that's something that has been useful for me. Many processes, many practices, many movements in cities, they're unpredictable, they're rhythmic, they're seasonal, some of them are interrupted. There's a lot of flow and flux. And so how do you then build models or explanations that do this at the core of theory, at the core in the classroom, rather than really doing it at the peripheries, at the margins, sort of as experimentation? So this was something to really think about and work on. One of the best ways that I found to do this is really then this project of rethinking and relearning through practice, and particularly doing this doing this from practice in collaboration with others. A lot of this has been then about working in a particular place or a particular site or a space or a sector to uncover other ways of knowing, seeking to expand what constitutes official repertoires of knowledge and expertise, building new vocabularies, engaging in acts of translation, thinking very much about the different words that people use, the different language they use, and how these, if we are sufficiently attuned, they can help us to really recreate and enter the worlds that people live in. And then really, in some ways, to expand then the life worlds that we're actually considering when we're thinking about planning, or we're thinking about design, or thinking about policy. So really very much drawing from notions of I think, recent theoretical work, particularly in not just in cities, but much broader, on the notion of the pluriverse, or this idea of multiple worlds coexisting. Um, a second kind of way in which, apart from practice, is really been relearning through engaging in creative practice, and more artistic kind of endeavors. And I think, Gautam, you and I were talking about this earlier, but in the last few years, I've been working a lot with this kind of experimentation of form, of language, of medium. And it's been enormously generative. It has also forced me to get out of my disciplinary silo, the set of expertise, the methodologies, the theorists that I learned from, and actually engage with new ones, typically in conversation, in collaboration with teams of people. And I think there's something enormously liberating, even though it's really challenging, to actually just say I'm a learner, and I have no clue what I'm talking about, but I'm just going to say it anyway. And so there's something liberating, I think, in being able to profess a lack of knowledge, and a willingness to learn and be open. So I think that's been really interesting. And I think the third thing I would talk about in terms of this relearning has been not so much learning particular subjects or content, but it's in fact learning. It's really about cultivating the right set of sensitivities, of sensibilities. I think in your book, you all talked about it as dispositions, but how do you actually uh, sort of nurture within yourself and within others this ability to listen well, to hone instincts, to understand what people are saying, to be attuned to what their words really mean. The art of negotiation. I mean, there are many like this, but I think these are all, in some ways, kind of skills and arts that uh, we really need to. We're not always trained to do them. Some people do them better than others, but I think we can all work at them. And I think this is not I'm not giving you a laundry list. There are many more that go towards really helping to think about then interdisciplinary work and cultivating this sort of repertoire of skills, of arts that can help us sort of do this better. The final one I want to really say in terms of relearning is through people relations, through relation or social relations. Some of my best interdisciplinary work has been with people I call friends. A lot of this has been over time, built through slower processes, long, slow thinking, a lot of fun, maybe some, drinks, samosa, etc. All unhealthy and healthy stuff. But really, it's to create, I think, this a space where we feel safe, we feel comfortable to experiment, to contest, to fight with each other, but in ways that ultimately can help us move forward in this interdisciplinary work. So that's the end of my set of relearning. I think I just want to end and then move on and give the floor to my co-conspirators here, is really maybe very briefly to talk about the limits to interdisciplinarity. There are very significant limits, I think. And so I think partly we have to be careful also not to put too much of a gloss on interdisciplinarity. Too many words nowadays are used too freely and too loosely. So I think really to be cautious of when it makes sense to do this, how much time can we commit, what is the balance, also problems of turf, problems of tribalism. It's really not very easy um, to try to straddle disciplines when people who are senior to you or very established, sort of, don't allow it or see you as a betrayer or a traitor to the cause, whatever. There are so many ways of, but I think so. I think really this question of and the idea of limits is something that maybe would be worth discussing a little bit more. But thank you so much.
Thank you in the first instance, Neha, for inviting me to join this panel. I am, at least in many ways a lapsed academic, although I insist that I continue to feel as academic as as I ever have been. So a little bit about me and my work earlier, and then I have three observations to make about interdisciplinarity, borrowing both on my earlier work and my new work, and then I'll end a little bit about how exactly we look at interdisciplinarity at Science Gallery, Bengaluru, where I work now. So I'm a historian of science and technology by training, which appears to be a discipline sort of which is which appears to be a field which is across disciplines, but that's not the case. It's a discipline formulated at boundaries of different disciplines and fields, but the tools are very much that of a historian, right? Like, and I know on occasion that of an anthropologist. So in that sense, it's a lovely deceptive discipline, which I enjoy very much. In many ways, what historians of science do is they make knowledge about knowledge making, right? Like, so that's kind of, we look at, human scientists, human natural social scientists, depending on who we take fancy to, and then we look at how they make knowledge. That having said, my first experience of very consciously thinking about of a pedagogical exercise in interdisciplinarity was when we were putting together the doctoral program at the India Institute at King's College London, where I used to teach before I moved to Bangalore, where we were an institution, not an institute, we were an institute to study contemporary India. And we all faculty came from different disciplines, and the goal was to train a new generation or several new generations of students. And at that was the first time I was confronted with the concern of how do you even train these students, right? Like, and they would have to be trained from well, one is the limits, as you said, of what we were trained in and what we were capable of, but then what were these students going to be capable of? And I think that was the first time when I looked at interdisciplinarity for pedagogy quite seriously, and then assembled coursework on what one might call scholarly traditions available to study contemporary India, right? Like, I mean, it's a mouthful, but that was the idea behind then setting up that curriculum for doctoral training in order for students to be trained in order to do then disciplinary work, but then they were borrowing both research methods as well as perspectives that came from different disciplines to study this one thing, which was contemporary India. So I have three observations to make. The first is about how the interdisciplinarity even occurs, and I think the one observation that stays with me through my both pedagogical research as well as now practice journey is the need actually to quite consciously distinguish between problem solving and knowledge making, because interdisciplinarity in problem solving is an obvious tool, right? Like, where you converge on a problem, and therefore interdisciplinarity has a purpose to come together because you are kind of working your way towards something. Whereas in knowledge making, it's not so obvious why you might actually want to talk to others, right? Because your questions, your conferences, your journals in many ways have over time, layer upon layer, set the agenda for what is worth studying and how one might study it. And there then to actually make room for conceptually, theoretically, intellectually what other disciplines might bring in is an exercise that has to be refreshed from time to time. And the reason for that might not be always apparent, and at least not immediately so. And so I think sort of being aware, and especially I say this because we are at the Indian Institute of Human Settlements, and I work at Science Gallery, where these things, at least in public discourse, get conflated quite easily. So, solving an urban concern, or not solving an urban concern, conceptualizing an urban concern and then working towards solutions, of course, it demands interdisciplinarity. And so, how do you then separate that out from, not necessarily separate, but parse it usefully to say, when is it that we are making new knowledge? When is it that we are bringing new conceptual theoretical tools? And when do we see the need for it? So where is the need for interdisciplinarity? How, why, and how do we approach it? That's my first observation. The second is alertness towards the hierarchies, especially between the human, social, and natural sciences. Very often, certain disciplines are are seen to have priority. So in a sense, uh, when do you demand knowledge from other disciplines, right? Like, when do you expect, and to what end, right? Like, and so when that comes together, especially in the Indian context, I think, and seen from the history of science, philosophy of science, science and technology studies, and sociology of science, there is that tension, right? Like where both frameworks as well as theoretical, how should I, epistemological frameworks seem to seem to the epistemological frameworks arriving from the natural sciences seem to have a better position when seen with the other sciences, with the human and social sciences. And I mean, physics envy is not is a, how do you call it, you should ask the economists. It's it's a very real phenomenon, which of course economics, as if you ask me as a historian, is a made up discipline altogether. Because when do human beings behave in any way, to a script? They're always drifting from any script given to them. So hierarchies need to be understood. I mean, one may problematize it. I've kind of caricatured it because I have a minute to explain to you, but I think there are. So where are the epistemological frameworks coming from? What is setting the intellectual agenda for interdisciplinarity? Something that we need to remain alert to all the time. And the third observation that I want to make, and the last observation before I speak a little bit about the gallery, is, I mean, we've had many of these prefixes, right? Like interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, across disciplines, anti-disciplinarity, something that came from the MIT Media Lab, for example, where sort of you're looking at spaces between disciplines that fail to get captured intellectually because, disciplines fail to kind of address them, so on and so forth. It in many ways speaks back to the first observation that I made, which is what do you converge on? When is the need for convergence articulated, and to what end or why? So in that sense, interdisciplinarity is a shape-shifting idea. And why that matters, why that observation matters, is because is interdisciplinarity an exercise in tool making, or is it an exercise in assembling a toolbox, right? So are you kind of, is it about bringing what one might call mixed methods kind of research, right? Like, so are you assembling a toolbox of useful methods that come from different disciplines that allow you to address a concern, and that would then speak to either problem solving or knowledge making? Or is it an exercise in tool making itself? And I think that is something, because what also happens often, or has happened to some extent, is that when it is an exercise in tool making, it ends up becoming a field or discipline in itself. And I think those are, so again, these are not problems, but these are observations, and being alert to them is useful, because that then allows you to make, better, more, not necessarily precise, but better formulated knowledge claims, better formulated ideas, and so on and so forth. So coming back to the science gallery, and to close my observations, what interdisciplinarity allows us to do is to produce objects of display and exhibits. And what do I mean by that? We bring knowledge and knowledge makers from different disciplines. We bring artistic research and knowledge making practices also from engineering and design. So basically, what am I saying? We are agnostic to where people come from, as long as they have the rigor that their discipline allows them. In order to produce objects of display or exhibits and programming, why do we do this? We do this so that it becomes visible to our audience that there are different ways of making knowledge. There are different ways of knowing. There are different ways of making truth claims. There are different standards and formulations. And by standards, again, this is not used to establish a hierarchy, but to say that there are different ways of conceptualizing what counts for evidence in making a truth claim. And that matters because we are in a way shaped up, our lives are shaped by how these claims matter and what they shape. They shape technologies, they shape practices, they shape our ability to access social justice, so on and so forth, right? And so what we're able to showcase in the gallery is bringing together knowledge makers and designers, architects, and engineers to produce objects that embody such claims that can then be communicated to the public. And we found, so we are on our 8th exhibition right now. I call them research festivals because, in a way, what we are creating is a public life for research. What we found over time is that it's hard to, in many ways, distinguish for our audiences, which is brilliant, as to what claim came from the human or the social or the natural sciences, which I think is fabulous because, that coming from the human and social sciences myself too, studying the natural sciences, studying about actually, not the natural sciences alone. This is, I mean, to me, it's an accomplishment and one could stop there. But actually, if we don't create the opportunity for our audience to see the distinctions in a way as to how this knowledge gets made, then in a way we are not equipping them in any better equipping them any better to make these distinctions in order to make decisions in their day-to-day life. So what we've started doing, two things, is one is we put what are called process documents. So how did this object on display, how this exhibit on display get made at all? And so we have literally at times we have sort of drawings, charts, notes. How did this come together? And then we also put research papers that back that exhibit from the human, social, and natural sciences as may be relevant for reading on. So we might be, and is this being recorded? Yeah. Okay. I mean, I have no idea what kind of copyright violations that means. But anyway, we put those papers for people to read. And they're there in a folder for people to, people to see. And so, for example, I'll end with using one example to help you sort of just grapple, because in the abstract it's like, oh yeah, we do this, but what do we do? So we have an exhibit by an artist called Rajeshri Goody, which is called Don't Lick It Up, or in its original form it was called Ukadla, which represents which is an assembly of the kinds of foods that Dalits have been eating over time in an exhibition called Calorie. So she's made these foods which are often sort of leftovers, half-eaten kind of food, in ceramic, and she's assembled it in a circular format. And I mean, once you recognize what it is, it breaks your heart, of course. But what we've done is, alongside that, so she herself has collected recipes which we have put in, which she has made booklets of, which we put next to the exhibit itself as well. In the process and the papers that are available for people to see, we have papers by nutritionists talking about social marginalization and nutrition. We have papers by social scientists talking about caste and nutrition. All of this available for our audiences to read, to see why this piece of work, which in many ways is a work of many ways, no, it is a work of art, but it's also artistic research, backed in many ways in multiple ways by research from the human and social and natural sciences. So that's the work that we do. We do our best, and hopefully, we'll do better with time. Thank you for your attention.
So I will build on what Lalita and Janvi and Neha have introduced for all of us. I start with two fields of inquiry or knowledge production, or call them interdisciplinary now, but how they evolved. So hydrology, right? So basically, what is it? In its simplest form, it's the how water is distributed over space and time, and how water moves between these different spaces over time. So it was dominated by folks who were trained in engineering as when the field started. And but then soon enough, when hydrologists started looking at slightly larger catchments or areas, they discovered that vegetation uses water. Um, at the same time, there were ecologists who were discovering and finding out that organisms, plants and animals, respond to the availability of water over space and time. So there are two groups of people who never met for a long time, and but then the folks who had come from the engineering side, they could not really unpack the vegetation. For them, okay, you need to know what trees they are, what the rooting depths are, how much water each one uses. So you need to know the species and so on. So that's where their limits, they could form certain limits. Okay, this is something that I won't be able to do. Similarly, the ecologists also, after a point, because they didn't understand enough about the distribution of moisture over space and time, they also had in some sense a place where they had to say that, okay, I need to know more about the others, of how moisture moves around. And over a period of, it took about 150 years before this field called ecohydrology came about, which basically uh, brings together the distribution of moisture over space and time, and how uh, plants basically uh, can impact that. And then you bring in people who require both water and plants, and they do different things with water and different things with plants for our existence. And so now it has now become so the limits that people recognized to be able to solve in some sense a wicked problem, which is basically how to manage water over for competing demands. I think that it took a while for this to evolve. So now it's a fairly well established field. There are even journals dedicated to it. I'll give another example where interdisciplinarity had to come in. Otherwise, we would be in serious trouble. We had ecologists and wildlife biologists in India for a long time. They did fantastic work understanding how one organism interacted with another, or how plants and animals interacted with one another or with the environment. Fantastic work. That was really important knowledge. When when the when those folks realize that what they are studying and what they love, that's beginning to disappear, then the crisis discipline of conservation science evolved. And when ecologists dominated it, they were floundering, because conservation is doesn't requires a lot more than ecology. You have to deal with people whom ecologists for a long time, wildlife biologists, the only people that really dealt with were in terms of a power hierarchy. Because if you to need access to a national park or a sanctuary, you went through the forest department. You applied for a permit. You went with their, in some sense, because they were the stewards of the forest. So you went with that power behind you, and the same arena at that time, this was a few decades ago, was not available to social scientists who might want to work with the people who are actually in the forest or around the forest. So for a while, when the ecologists, wildlife biologists dominated conservation science, it led to a terrible set of outcomes. And in terms of certain models of conservation that really don't work, or would have a short-lived life, simply because those types of top-down systems would not function, where people were, in some sense, not even part of the seen as part of the. And so the discipline of conservation science now is an interdisciplinary field. And there's a recognition that you cannot do conservation without a strong social science dimension to it. And now you will find a new breed of ecologists who are actually much more conscious about this. And this has happened relatively recently. And I've sort of seen both. I've had colleagues and friends who straddled this. So now we know that conservation is a wicked problem. It does require interdisciplinarity. Ecohydrology was a interdisciplinary within the biophysical sciences, because you can look at it as ecology and hydrology both being on the biophysical side, but conservation science is straddling social and biological sciences. So that's two sort of models of interdisciplinarity where it had to come. And so that's where where you so how do you, for an individual to internalize various disciplines? I mean, it's quite tough, right? All of us have certain training, we have a certain background. So for example, I have never done any biology after high school. So whatever ecology or biology I've learned is through either learning from students or other folks, or through practice. So it takes a long time, right? So similarly, there would be many folks who are trained in the social sciences also, who, if you have to work on issues related to, say, ecological systems, they would also have to learn over a period of time. It won't come through the training they've had necessarily. Maybe some folks are lucky to have some exposure to that, but generally most of us would have some sort of more disciplinary oriented training. So how do you then become interdisciplinary when you know that you have a disciplinary background? So one, I mean, from what I feel is that one is that you definitely keep your feet firmly grounded in the discipline where you think you have some strength, and uh, and then you reach out, and you can have conversations. So how do you do that? So if an ecologist had to say learn to work in an interdisciplinary way, um, and going to a place, a new region, there might be an anthropologist there who knows that place really well, or a historian would know that place really well. The conversation between folks who actually relate to the place, because you know that you want to be in the, you want to understand, unravel that place in all its complexity. A place based conversation can happen between folks who come from different disciplines, and that can lead to a co-production of interdisciplinary knowledge over a period of time, without either of these folks actually having to really, uh, in some sense, not necessarily have to stand on one feet or stuff like that, but you can have that. But you have to learn enough about the other field to have a meaningful conversation, right? So, for example, if I had to work with somebody who uh, who's looking at the social dimensions of some conservation problem, I can't call people living there as forest dwellers or just people or humans. I have to know what communities they are, where they come from, uh, what is their history. Similarly, you would a social scientist who gets into say an ecological field or a conservation field can't just say that these are just trees or these are just uh, some birds, right? You have to at least get there a little bit, and that's where that bridge space has to be created, where there will be mutual respect between folks. Okay, so this person is actually making an attempt to know a little bit more about the plants and animals, and then the ecologist is making an effort to actually learn a little bit about the people, and not treating them as some sort of an entity, one box of just people or communities. So I think that middle ground, reaching that middle ground, that conversation, I think is important. That's one way I think that interdisciplinarity can be fostered, is to find those spaces for conversations. And I know there will be some clumsiness, there will be some mistakes made. Somebody might not be able to identify 5 species of birds that the ecologists might think, okay, how can they even not know this, or 10 species of trees that are in that area. And similarly, the ecologists may not know everything about the different communities who live in a place and their histories. But I think that with mutual respect, I think that one can, and without any patronizing uh, on either side, I think it will really help to find the opportunities for doing that. So, and I think similarly, even when we are teaching interdisciplinarity, I think there's different ways in which you can reach an interdisciplinary without making a fetish of it, right? Because there are some, I mean, you definitely want an ecologist who can identify all 5 species of birds, right? You can't say I'm interdisciplinary. I think it's one of these 3 species of birds, right? You can't, right? You do want that ecologist to know all of it. Similarly, you can't have a ecologist saying, I think it is one of these 3 communities. I don't know exactly or something, right? It's not going to work. So that I think is where the boundaries one has to recognize and then make that effort to, and then, okay, you can't recognize maybe all species of birds, but maybe you can go up to, that they are birds of prey, they're seed eaters or whatever, some functional guilds. That's enough. I mean, the ecologist will immediately say, okay, this person has actually made the effort to reach up to their limit in terms of engaging with my field, and I'm going to also do the same. So I think that this is where, I mean, I would say different models of interdisciplinarity can emerge with mutual respect and with and I know that it is tough out there to establish yourself in an interdisciplinary, in terms of thinking and knowledge production and also publication. So I have to publish in a hydrology journal, which is a card carrying hydrologist will publish in. before they'll respect me for publishing something interdisciplinary. It's happened. Similarly, if I didn't publish, even though I've not taken any biology or ecology after high school, but now, if I do publish in ecology journal, and after that I do some interdisciplinary work, those same ecologists will say, okay, I'm going to read this, I'm going to listen to this person. So because some folks are still, they have that this is what is required for this to be called this pot of knowledge, or and so on. So that is also that's the real world. Every journal is now portraying itself as interdisciplinary, but yes, they are sort of still got roots in one or more disciplines. And yes, there are some spaces which are more interdisciplinary in that sense, but you will again find political ecology, for example. The ecologists complain there isn't enough ecology in it. And why did political ecology come? Because the ecologists couldn't even think about power hierarchy and how different people are impacted by the environment, or how the benefits of the environment come to different. I mean, how it's distributed. So they couldn't figure it out. So the field of political ecology had to emerge, but then it goes through its ups and downs. And from what I can see, that there's not enough ecologists engaging with political ecology at the moment. So it will go. Hopefully, that will happen with the field. But these are just some thoughts I thought might be useful for continuing this conversation.
Thank you. Thanks very much to all three of you. As you're gathering your thoughts together, there are a couple of things that I thought I just pulled together from this, and I think there were two or three things that really stood out. I think one was the idea of place or site in being able to hold this idea of interdisciplinarity, and it could be a space like the science gallery, or it could be the site in which you work, across, whether it's in conservation science, or a city, or a neighborhood. I think that is something that I would like to hear a little bit more about. The other thing that I feel was really nice to hear and come out was this idea of power. Or there was the power of hierarchies, or the power of sort of discipline, knowledge, but also the ways in which kind of the processes of knowledge making and problem solving and have their sort of ebbs and flows, and the way the sort of power of making those spaces and of knowledge kind of emerges and flows. And I thought that was actually kind of a really, really interesting thing. And the third thing that I really liked, and I think we don't talk about enough, is this idea of the limits to interdisciplinarity, and this constant tension between both as educators, as researchers, as policymakers, as academics. How do we grapple with this tension of how much sort of discipline focus is enough, and how much more interdisciplinarity do we need? And so I was wondering if you'd like to reflect on any one, all three of these across the panel. Maybe we start with Jagdish.
I just
First. Yes, of course.
I was going to actually just add I don't know if it's a question or a provocation, but not just to the two panelists here, but maybe to everyone. But really, I was really reflecting on this, particularly when you were speaking, Jagdish, about this idea of, and so in some ways I can see that broadly, one of the most common ways to think about interdisciplinarity is to set yourself within a discipline, your own home discipline, as you typically think of it. And you see that as your strength, that where you sort of ground yourself, and then you expand yourself across the boundaries into other disciplines. And then through that, you do that in different ways. But that's one particular way of then working with existing disciplinary boundaries, accepting those disciplinary boundaries as not just fine, but it's not just a status quo, but this is what knowledge is. This is the boundary. So it's really in some ways about expanding maybe the knowledge, or potentially creating new fields over time as needed. But I think I'm just wondering about the other approach, or another approach, which is a bit more of a big bang approach perhaps, but really one of thinking about, are we fine with such existing disciplinary boundaries itself? And I think that's really, the provocation I want to put. What would it be like to actually, for us to imagine a different way of learning? And I think I'm not saying here that there should be absolutely no boundaries, because obviously we each need to. I mean, there's a limit to how much one can sort of understand, and there are all kinds of issues. But I think the way we've configured disciplines, or the way they are configured currently, are a particular way of configuring. And maybe even to throw that out to the mix to say, is that configuration also under discussion, or are we just accepting that and thinking about sort of working in a more smaller scale kind of way? But
I mean, in a way, this is not new, right? Like, no, that's what historians always say. This shit has happened before. So, I mean, so, if you think of natural philosophy and moral philosophy, they are precursors to what today is disciplinary knowledge, right? Like, so what we see as disciplines or as sort of established ways of knowing is very new. It's only like the turn of the 19th century that you have sort of significant consolidation around, significant consolidation of what we today understand as boundaries between disciplines. And so, yeah, I mean, in fact, what is valuable in natural philosophy, for example, right? The fact that it was not only nature but also philosophy. And I think, what does that kind of epistemology allow us to think? And in fact, that's what informs the nature lab at Science Gallery, to say that if one particular way of understanding nature, or one way of knowing nature and understanding nature has brought us to pandemics and climate change, then what would be another way of knowing nature? And if we were to sort of reimagine a natural history collection today, what would that look like? So that in fact informs the nature lab at the gallery, for example. And we have 4 other labs as well. They're fairly mad. But again, so we've had this before, right? Like, we've had natural philosophy and moral philosophy as precursors to today's disciplines. So, as they say, there's no stepping in the river, same river twice. So it's not about a return, but it's about a reimagination of what are these boundaries useful for. And I think, for me, sort of the question is something that I alluded to in my observations, which is, what are we converging for, right? Like, what are we questioning those boundaries for? What is it that informs or calls for interdisciplinarity? And for problem solving, it's very obvious. It's the otherwise that's more interesting, right? Like, so why would I, as a historian of science, want to talk to, I don't know, someone else, right? Like, yeah, I mean, people as it is, it's very difficult to talk to people, right? Like, I mean, human beings. But why? What are we talking for? Right? Like, so what are we converging for is a very important question, right? Like, and I think not because one accepts the boundaries, but because one wants to know why one is doing what one is doing, right? Like, and I think it's not easy to grapple with. I mean, I have no answer, obviously, but yeah.
I think that we have underestimated the capacity of folks to actually uh, become interdisciplinary at an early. So there have been so many polymaths and even like Bayesian statistics. Bayesian, that was found by Reverend Bayes. I don't know how much theology he did, how good he was in theology, but Bayes, he's famous for Bayes' theorem. And similarly, Leonardo da Vinci or so. I mean, there's so many examples of folks who have had to. You even look at the writings of early explorers and naturalists. I mean, they tried. Of course, describing the geology, the people, with of course the different degrees of success in terms of what they could, coming from their perspective as explorers with the usually many they came from a colonizing with a colonizing force behind them with all that power, and but still they managed to, well, it was whether it's Humboldt or whether it's anybody else, you will see that geology, botany, and even some anthropology comes in their writings. So I think there was a natural instinct to try to learn about the complexity of new places that they went to and were exploring, and so in that sense, I think that we have not been able to capture that in our training, and so we would probably, and how much of that dose you should have at what stage in your training is another question. another, because all of us have different capacities to how much math we can take, how much social science theory or politics, how much where do we how do we say that this is the right dose for at this stage of somebody's training? I think that's a really difficult and some of us might come to it a little later, and that's fine. Some of us will find some other way of getting to it. I think it's we also have to think about the capacity of institutions and faculty and people to actually foster this interdisciplinary, right? To make it into a fetish and say that we're going to do this, but actually in terms of learning outcomes, in terms of the experience, in terms of this balance between depth and breadth, if we get it wrong, then you we'll get into a lot of problems, right? So that's where I just thought I'll share that.
No, I think you've raised a very important point, and this is something So in 2016, I wrote an essay about what we call integrated science education, and so curricular reform is critical, right? Like it's very, very critical because, and my favorite examples to your Reverend is Thomas Hobbes, who we know today for the Leviathan, but he was also, I mean, he did geometry, right? Newton was an alchemist and what is it? Something of the Mint, Royal Mint in London, and also, a mathematician and a physicist, right? Like so, but these are anachronistic terms that we're using for him because he was doing natural philosophy, right? But curricular reform is critical for both institutional capacity, but also otherwise. But I think, and that's where I think India is particularly handicapped, or in India, we are particularly handicapped because we don't really have universities, right? Even we have institutions of higher learning, some of them incredible ones, but we don't have engineers study with engineers. This is my favorite phrase, right? Engineers are studying with engineers, architects are studying with architects, artists are studying with artists, humanists are studying with humanists. Between those wonderful ages of 17 and 25, when you're your most confident best, you're not punctured by anybody from any other discipline, right? You're not like, that is that age when you're dating people, when you're drinking, when you're doing all sorts of things, and you're not meeting anyone who's not in the same career path as you. I mean, those paths might change afterwards, but no physicist is getting beaten up by a big historian, right? Like, or no small historian is getting sort of, undermined by an artist, or no artist is getting sort of, supported or held up by, whoever, right? Add your favorite, or not so favorite disciplines. But I think that's where the particular handicap comes from for the Indian context, for both practice as well as for knowledge making, because we don't come equipped with mind frames or the vocabulary to even engage with by the time we've finished with our degree work, right? Like, and so it's I think it's particularly sort of harmful. And so at that point, because I was just starting out in my academic journey, I was audacious enough, so I proposed like a curricular reform for and suggested, especially because engineers were the ones who had to be transformed, right? Like, because it's pain of the country, sorry. And no, but I mean, again, it's not just the country, right? Like the how do you call it? The figure of the intellectual for the longest time had been someone, a literary figure, a public intellectual. At some point in the second half of the 20th century, we also had some natural scientists showing up, especially physicists. So, the Oppenheimers, the Bhabhas, the Joliot-Curies, so on and so forth. And today it's the engineer, right? And sort of highly, sort of distasteful ones, who are the figure of knowledge and problem solving in the public domain. And, so that also, that has specific consequences. But coming back to curricular reform, I mean, two things that, I don't know how to transform the Indian university landscape that easily. But two things that can be done is that the foundation here for people across disciplines, whether you want to be an engineer or a rocket scientist or whatever it is, should be the same. It has to be the same. And the second thing that can be done is when you have proper universities, is literally leave it for the student to decide what they want to study. Let them fumble through whatever. They want to do drama, let them do drama. They want to do physics, let them do physics. Leave them alone. They will find the pathways that are suitable for their interests, for their motivation, for where they want to go. They will find newer ways of knowing. They will find newer ways of consolidating what we already know. The thing is, right now we're educating people to, in what we know, because somehow some people know and others have to learn how to know. we do not leave open the doors for adding layers to that layers to that knowledge while people are learning. We have very closed education systems, right? Like with the labs, for example, and this is something my husband and I, who I drag everywhere because he visits only sometimes in the year, is that we have close-ended experiments in the lab. The results are already known. If you fail to produce that result, then you copy your neighbor's lab results, or you keep doing it until you get the result you're supposed to get, as opposed to actually writing a report on, I did this experiment, I followed this protocol, I got this result, now I want to understand why I got this result. that's not that's not an opportunity, right? Like, I mean, and I think so those are some, I mean, again, I mean, these are not things that are unknown to many of us, right? But leave it open for them to choose. I mean, it's like when I was, when I finished school, it was like those ridiculous acronyms, PCB or PCM, and I'm, I'm not going to do any of that, right? It's like, sorry for those of you who were fortunate enough to not have to deal with this, physics, chemistry, biology, or physics, chemistry, math, right? I mean, why? What if I want to do geography? What if I want to do logic? What if I want to do history? What if I want to, so the curricular reform, enough.
On that note, I'd like to open it up to folks in the audience. There are mics coming around. So Amit and then Amog.
So I completed a PhD between architecture and urban planning. So I've been kind of struggling with a lot of these issues of interdisciplinarity, and how do I sort of communicate with people who are kind of more sociologically oriented and who are kind of more artistic. Uh, and during the struggle, just came to me. We attended this class called the Theories of Knowledge, and I was like, wait, this should have been taught in high school. Before, at the time when I was choosing my science and math or whatever. I just feel that the schooling system simply doesn't allow for kids to be able to choose in an informed way. I mean, we're waiting. Sorry? And parents, yeah. Yeah. And that really, I think, does limit. And so, yeah. The other question I had was, we're talking about a spectrum of knowledge, and we're talking about the social sciences, we're talking about history, we're talking about science. And of course, we've got these three categories. Can we identify certain practices which are more interdisciplinary than others, and then be able to, step out from there? For example, I feel like architecture and urban planning, obviously we're having this discussion here, are far more kind of need to be far more interdisciplinary, and these um, these subjects could be kind of places from where sort of a broadening or the connection to something which is more specialized happens.
So maybe we'll take a couple of questions and then leave it at that.
Thank you. So for my question, I'm going to be a little bit provocative, and I'm going to take everything that was discussed right now and ask you to reflect upon it at this particular moment in time. And the reason I'm saying this is because I'm just coming out of an environment where I've had to deal with this whole issue of interdisciplinarity, and I don't think it's going to end at any point soon. But I would like to ask all the panelists to think a little bit more about this relationship that exists between interdisciplinarity and power at this particular point in time, when universities around the world are under assault in some way or the other. Funding is being cut, right? We're a shortage of funds. And faculty and departments are being asked to choose between different kinds of programs and different kinds of curriculum and syllabuses, right? And think a little bit more on the how power within institutions, within universities, can sometimes see interdisciplinarity as a way to expand on some particular arenas of the university while shutting down others. So basically to say, oh, look, we have had these disciplines which have been in existence for a very long time, and they are becoming more and more obsolete. Let's shut them down, bring in more interdisciplinarity, and create this kind of artificial binary sometimes between disciplines and interdisciplinarity. And I'm speaking from a very particular experience here, which I'm not going to elaborate on, but but kind of use interdisciplinarity as a way to create this binary, which I'll be very frank, I don't particularly agree with. But also, like, if you do this at a time when you're being forced to make budgetary decisions to favor one discipline versus another, it also results in the shutting down the departments. It results in archives and libraries being defunded, whole bodies of knowledge being lost, right? So to just kind of come back to my question, I would like to encourage much everyone in the room to think of interdisciplinarity not just as this new exciting arena that is kind of pushing back against older practices, but also as part of an ecosystem of a new kind of hegemony that is coming up, and to think about the kind of responsibilities and ethics that we have to think about as interdisciplinary scholars, and how do we establish that in the institutions that we function in. That, I don't know if that made any sense, but yeah.
I just finished an interdisciplinary degree, and I think listening to you talk, I can't quite decide whether I've now become a jack of all trades or whether I'm actually super specialized in the interdisciplinary in the Venn diagram. So I feel like while I appreciate interdisciplinary approaches to working, I'm having a hard time figuring out whether an interdisciplinary master's is a good use of somebody's time. Yeah.
Maybe we'll respond to these and then take another round. So, in whatever order you'd like to take.
The sometimes I'm just one example that comes to my mind is in another institution when we were admitting candidates to our interdisciplinary PhD program. Uh, f- uh, there were folks who had actually been who had the jargon and actually had the right terms to use, for getting into the interdisciplinary program because of the type of institutions they were in, the type of agency they had, the social capital they had because of where they came from and who they were, which was not there in some folks who came in. They might have been to some university elsewhere or a college in some other part of the country and those folks struggled, and there was this the folks who were pushing interdisciplinarity would and in some sense sometimes that can become like a filter, and then there were people had been trained in some other discipline, and then they would eventually they would embrace interdisciplinarity on their own terms. But I think that's where I think that it has to be fostered, and to use that as a filter in say that this person is not using the right terms or the right I was not able to describe a particular. I think that's why we have to be a little careful, that we just have to probe enough to see, okay, is this individual open to this foray or this journey, and not make it as in some sense another barrier. I think that's where because people are going to come from various backgrounds, and they will all, I think we need to find a way of making sure that we don't put up any more barriers than that already are. And I've seen people who come from disciplinary backgrounds and do really good work afterwards because they actually got the opportunity. And there were other folks who, they already had the privilege of being in a interdisciplinary, they'd taken courses in different disciplines or been exposed to that. So they definitely had an edge over. But I think over a period of time, I think one can level the field. So I don't know whether that's answered anybody's question, but it's something that came to my mind.
Well, I mean, thanks for the questions. I mean, I'll just briefly, I think, maybe start with the question on applied disciplines. Can we start from interdisciplinary spaces like planning or architecture, because they're sort of built from many disciplines? I mean, two things. I was going to say my own experience as a planner and of people who do planning is that that's not actually always the case. And partly, I think this is also because it depends on what so many times the people doing planning, especially if you're looking in India, a lot of the people doing planning are actually people trained as engineers. So, I mean, I don't want to add to the sort of bad mouthing here. There are many great engineers, but there are some really, really bad ones as well. And so I think many who work in not just the public sector, but, even in the private, I mean, so the kind of way in which planning is done, I think, so that's one kind of way in which, so I think not necessarily is the planning field then or the design field more open or accepting, of interdisciplinarity. I know there's also a big difference between, for example, the ones who were trained, the ones who did research, sort of produced knowledge. For example, those who did PhDs in planning, and then those who actually did masters in planning, and sort of were the ones who were actually going to presumably problem solve and work in different kinds of practice oriented. And so I think the kind of education that both these sets get is also quite different, and I think the motivations, the orientations are also quite different. So I think thinking about, so it's not necessarily the space of an applied discipline which will actually provide the necessary openness. Sometimes it does, but not necessarily, is what I would say. So I would just basically say that we all have to use whatever opportunities and openings that we see, and sometimes they come from these spaces and sometimes they don't. So I mean, that's really a response. And I think I'll just quickly touch upon your question, Amok. I really appreciate the question. I think there's no doubt that with different kinds of funding cuts, the kinds of pressures that there are on universities, and given existing power disparities. I mean, I think like every field, I mean, so recently, because I'm trained in planning, I've been looking at the newer field within planning of climate plans. And just to give an example, what you see in climate plans are a lot of what you see in other kinds of plans, largely because the infrastructure of planning, the institutions, the actors, the processes, they're all the same. They're just the same, a lot of the same people, maybe a few, some new ones. I'm not saying there's nothing new, but I'm saying the basic infrastructure, the matrix on which this is being built is the same. So a lot of the existing inequalities are being reproduced. They're just, the way they emerge and manifest are different because it's a different field, different sector. So just to say that I think this happens in every field, in every space. So similarly here, you have huge disparities, and I don't think there's. I mean, I think that's part of the whole work of then. In some ways, being interdisciplinary for me, as trained in the social sciences, is a way of seeking to level the field. So it's very much a political act, because as I see it in many fields that I work in, social scientists do not have much of a place. And even within social scientists, there's particular kinds of social scientists using particular methodology. So for example, more numbers-based, quantitative approaches, those, move ahead or are given far more, the economists again. But so I think if you talk about things like lived experience, that's very much relegated to the realm of anecdotes. I mean, we all know this. This is not new. So I think in that sense, interdisciplinarity for me is a way of also forcing open certain fields to narratives, to voices, to perspectives, to sensibilities that don't sort of currently, have much, maybe not present at all, or very little presence. So that's, I mean, so I really don't think there's any way of getting around the fact that we all have to do more of this politics in order to level the playing field. It's, I think, far more than just a matter of ethics, because, I mean, in order to be more ethical, I think we will need to be more political, if I can put it that way. Especially since this is this calls for like some kind of power redistribution, and that's not going to be easy. It's going to be tough.
What's your interdisciplinary degree in?
Philosophy and AI.
Okay. So I just wanted to know the specifics before I say something and, put my feet and my palms both in my mouth. So, you know, it's not an easy question to answer, but I would not look at an interdisciplinary degree that's being offered. I mean, of course, a lot of that is being done by many universities now. Much of it also to attract new students, to make sure the corporation, not the corporation of the university in a way runs, right? Like, so it's a machine that has to be fed continuously. So there is some degree of very healthy skepticism one can have about the new kinds of degrees that people are that universities are now offering. That having said, the question of whether one is a jack of some trades and or a specialist in having firm feet in a discipline, I mean, this is a shifting ground in a way, right? Like, so if you look at someone like myself, for example, I have my first few degrees in civics and politics and then in history of science. I'm unemployable in any Indian university because they think I can neither teach civics or politics nor can I teach history of science because, all my degrees are not in the same discipline. So it depends on the context as to where your knowledge is valued. But the way I would also encourage you to think about interdisciplinarity is also that it gives you the ability to build big picture. So good generalists are also essential. Generalist is a bad word or is used as a bad word. I don't think it is, because if your robust disciplinary training can allow you to do certain kinds of things, a perspective that comes from knowing how different fields produce knowledge and therefore produce a picture of the world within which we are meant to act is not is not a trivial skill to have. Because if you can ask the big picture questions when discussing things, in fact, I think it's tremendously valuable no matter what you do. Because you can, when you're siloed, miss the big picture sometimes or miss part of the big picture, right? So I would look at it that way, that one gives the word generalist the kind of dignity that it needs to have when you're trying to ask big questions, when you're trying to do even problem solving. To be able to have a good overview is actually a very, very essential skill, no matter which field.
I just wanted to, throw a question back at you. Since I don't want us to do all the hard work here. Uh, but I'm just, this has been something, and I think prompted by some of the questions, but certainly the climate that we are all inhabiting. It's really a question of how much do you all believe that knowledge production, whether for research purposes or whether to solve problems, how much of that do you think is actually happening in formal university spaces, and will continue to be so? And I think this is really, I'd be curious in what folks have to say, because increasingly I'm beginning to believe that some of the most exciting work is happening outside of universities, and may also need to increasingly happen outside of universities. And maybe we can also imagine some of what those spaces could look like, but just wanted to throw that out there.
We take another round of questions.
Hi, it's just a reflection. I think I don't have any kind of solid question framed. So, as a child, I always wanted to do something different. So, I ended up like, I'm like 26-year-old, so I'm just giving the context. So, during school, yeah, in 10th standard, I had to pick up like what smart people pick. So, you end up picking PCB or PCM. So I picked up PCM. And then I had like developed some interest in like maths and like, but I was not great at it, but I was average in it. So your scores usually decide where you end up. So I gave the examinations and I ended up into this discipline called urban planning, which now after reaching there, I realized, okay, this is a very interdisciplinary course. But a lot of people during that time also had a question, what is it? Like you are studying ecology also, economics also, sociology also, geography as well, planning studios, transportation, etc., etc. By the end of 4 years, like in terms of employability aspect, we were considered nothing because we had community of engineers in our college. and they were considered to be the smarter people. So companies were coming to pick them up basically. So I picked up coding because of that, because I thought, okay, this is the skill which you need to be employable. So I ended up learning to code as well as being an urban planner. So I'm constantly like understanding what do you need to learn, like, because I consider myself to knowing disciplines from a superficial level. I'm always on in this context, okay, I know this little bit, but I also know that little bit, but then what can I do? And also I love to draw and I love to design. So then in the case of employability, I feel in job descriptions there are very set disciplines which are always, and projects also require certain kind of disciplines. Even at IIHS, being an interdisciplinary institution, I believe I'm kind of siloed in the terms of what kind of stuff I do, though I understand the generalist lens makes you think of the broader picture. But the kind of work you get to do is mostly based on the kind of expertise you have. So, how do you cross that, or like, how do you end up like covering everything but not? I'm not sure. Like, I don't know whether this is a question or a reflection.
We'll take a couple more, Gautam, and then I think there was one in the back as well.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for that. It was lovely to hear. Just, I have one reflection and one actual wonder. So, one of the things I was thinking of also is what is this in contrast to? Right? I mean, the question of having an uncertainty after interdisciplinarity seems to imply that you have certainty after disciplinary education. I have not encountered many people with disciplinary educations who are not equally uncertain and do not feel like jack of all trades and do not feel like any of those things. So, uncertainty is part of a relationship to knowledge in life. I think that this sense of linking it so closely to notions of education is the way we project other anxieties we have about ourselves onto our training, right? And which is good. That's how you survive life, right? You have to keep projecting and deflecting until, we're done. So, but I do think that there is something that is the notion of disciplinary taking away uncertainty because it gave you bounds means that you accepted those bounds as things that were right. And I think any person who is scholarly is not happy with boundaries of knowledge, whether they're disciplinary or not. So I think that in many ways, there's one way to shed it is to ask questions of all those sides. We never know the counterfactual. So I never had a disciplinary degree, not one, undergrad or masters, right? So I have never known what it is to know some kind of certainty that this is my field. But so then how do I know what I lack? That's the other kind of question that's there. But the thing I wanted to actually ask you, Janvi, a bit is about that curriculum question. I think about this a lot. And I think about what that nicer, more open curriculum. So say in 11th and 12th, we could do history and physics and geography and that. And some kids in some fancy schools in India do this. Huh? They say shit like this. I studied political philosophy of the environment in class 9. And you're like, fine. So but as a PCE, since we're throwing that out, it's one of the things I realized is I actually was able to think very deeply about the humanities because of the one teacher who taught me chemistry. Because her insistence was to explain the structure of thought. And it was not that it was deeply disciplinary. It was 11 CBSE. It was organic, inorganic. We had to memorize it, all of that. And she would say, memorize this. Now listen here. Think of how this goes from here to here. Think how a bond. So she would say, look at a bond, covalent, whatever. Then she's like, now think of two of you sitting next to each other and think of your bond. Now think of this bond. So I kept, to me, all the interdisciplinarity that was seeded in my head was because one teacher said, just think about how thinking works and don't think so much about what is being said, right? So there is somewhere within disciplines a training about the structures of thought. And I think that is actually that skill and tool. That means it's not that, I can certainly learn ecology, but if you leave me with something, I can do 1 + 1 = 2. I can start. And I have some way to say, give me some information and I will begin to put it together. And then you start seeing patterns in your head. And it's like, so I've always thought of interdisciplinarity as an X-ray. Like you show me a problem, I will try and X-ray it and say, what's the bones? What's the pipes? What's the fibers? So I also think in curriculum, how does one teach that? Because I can actually be taught 5 different disciplines badly and appear with nothing. And then I think you feel really a sense of loss. So sometimes I wonder, is it what we teach, or is it if we teach it well and how we teach it well? Because once you get to something fundamental enough, then instead of I'll study whatever I want, I'll put that Lego kit together to make whatever I want, right? Just tell me how to put Lego together. And then I will ignore the image on the box and I'll create. So I think a little bit also about what we seek vis-a-vis curriculum, right? I think the questions of power and political economy and skill are very real. But just before that, there is a moment to think about, if they weren't there, what is it that is actually worth knowing about thinking? And there are these moments, I think, if we collectively put our finger on, we would come with something else. So I wanted to just share that. It was just came to me from this. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, that's not even a question, right? Like what you've asked is so obvious. It's, I mean, as we say, right? Like when you're in school or college, what you need to learn is how to learn rather than what to learn. And once you know how to learn, you'll take that apparatus, you take your ability to think to no matter what material is thrown at you. It's hard, right? Because in especially in, I mean, I think in countries like Scandinavia and Germany, at least, school teachers are paid approximately the same amount as university teachers, for example, right? Like approximately, which tells you how society values school education. And so clearly there's that. And how many of your school teachers actually have PhDs, for example? How many of your college university professors have or teachers have PhDs and things like that? So there is that. And I mean PhD not like as a degree, right? Like, but as someone who has stayed with a problem over a long period of time in order to understand what does it take to think about resolving or understanding that problem or idea or concept better. So there is no solution to equipping people with how to learn, right? Like, and so I completely agree with you that that's the case. But we have but one life, and you come up with solutions based on where you are and what you think might be actually doable. Because in an ideal world, I'd like to see some change before I die, but obviously, I mean, increasingly I know that that's not going to happen. In the curriculum that I spoke that I sort of said, that sorry, in the curriculum that I proposed at that point of time, and it's gone nowhere, it's sitting in an essay. In the foundation year, what I thought one could do is not just teach those subjects, but actually sort of establish the relevance of those subjects, right? Like, and the way to establish relevance, it would be given again, we're all victims of our own limits, in a sense, right? Like, or victims, or that's the opportunity, that's also the limit. So borrowing also from history to kind of speak of how people made choices about how to learn, what to learn, when, right? Like, so pick up figures not in order to establish them as people who need to be emulated, but people who made choices. So how did they make choices, right? Like, so stories from the human, social, and natural sciences was sort of was what I thought would be foundational. I have actually, I mean, as I tried to note down, like, what were the 4 years going to look like? And I remember the last year, I remember the middle year, but I don't remember year 2 now. So, happy to share it with anyone who wants to have a look at it. But the last year was knowledge in my city, right? Like, so you pick up an idea or a thing. So nitrogen, right? Like, and run through your city for the whole year, find out where nitrogen comes from, where it is used, who uses it, is it taxed, is who regulates it, right? Like, so get the people, get the young people to form groups of 5 and then chase nitrogen, chase calcium, chase whatever it is, right? Like, or chase the forest, chase the bird, chase something. One of them was also like, and this idea borrowed also from where Roland, who's sitting right there at the back, studied in a program where they replicated historical experiments, right? Like, so can we do that in 1 year, right? Like, where you, again, the goal is not to actually replicate, how C.V. Raman did his experiment, but to work along. So do that process, right? Like, what would he have done in order to arrive at the Raman effect, for example? Because today you know the outcome of that, of the thing, but can you replicate that, pretending that you actually don't know what the outcome is going to be, because you're actually going to sit and explain why at times that experiment didn't work, right? And you can do that for the human and social sciences too. In fact, anthropologists, for example, have done this thing about M.N. Srinivas and the village, right? So can you now, obviously try not to burn your house down with your notes, which is what actually happened to him. But otherwise, can you replicate an anthropological experiment? Can you be an M.N. Srinivas and go somewhere, right? Like, and do that work, not necessarily in his village, but so can you replicate method? Can you replicate process, right? Like, and so these kinds of things, because what this does is it makes you pause and, okay, why am I doing this? Yeah, okay, I'm supposed to get that. So you learn through this. So trying to then do a slow burn process through all the 4 years, where these are projects which also throw you out of the campus and things like that. So a proposal, right? Like, again, I don't know how it'll work, and when it'll work, and just to not stop taking jibes at you, because IIT Bombay and engineers, he's my favorite engineer for the day. I mean, it, exactly to the point you made, Gautam, right? Like, I mean, what gives IITians the confidence to become investment bankers, man? I mean, they come out trained as mechanical and civil engineers and become investment bankers. Why? Right? Like, so what is it taking you, and planning cities? I mean, so what is it that takes you, or gives you the confidence that you can know something, right? Like, how can you instill that in your people? And if standardized testing is the only way to allow people to believe they can do something, it's a fairly tragic situation, no? I mean, we all know that.
Respond to Gautam's. I mean, I know Finland is like RT Nagar and a few other places in Bangalore in terms of population, maybe so of that scale. But the Finnish school model is something that we've all been reading about, learning about, where actually when children go out on any given day, they go out and they actually do a bunch of things, observations, measurements, and they really don't know whether they're doing biology, physics, math, and even stats. And they so that's something that I know that the scale at which it's done, but we should bring that, some of that. And we also had examples of other folks here, like the Madhya Pradesh, there was an experimental schools where science was, right? And Hoshangabad, Satgopal and other folks. And so we should probably try to build on that. And the other thing that comes to my mind is that look at art, cinema, novels, fiction, how interdisciplinary they are in terms of the richness. And they get it much better than many of us. I've seen movies where they brought together many dimensions in a manner that eludes so many of us in terms of description, in terms of balance of things. Or you look at the novels or whatever, or in some sense they are actually got a lot of actual history behind it. Amitav Ghosh's novels, either Hungry Tide or Sea of Poppies. And, it brings together so many things: the ecology, the geography, the history, the social sciences, all. And I think that I don't know exactly what his training was or where, but I think the folks who are in the arts and cinema and other who are novelists, they are actually, they've got it better than many of us. And I think we need to learn from that. I mean, it's just amazing how much there is. In fact, you even in some of the conventional Bollywood movies, as early as the mid 1970s, there was a movie called Kartavya. Yes, it had Dharmendra, it had Rekha, it had some Kartavya. Okay, that's the first movie in which ecosystem services was brought in the first scene, when that term was not known for anybody in the country. Nobody was teaching that in school, but that movie brought it to, because the first scene is about a veteran forester saying, if this forest goes, this water cycle will get disrupted, it'll affect people, and we have to go and conserve and all of that. And that was not being taught in school in any way. And they got it right. Of course, the rest of the movie had all the usual dances, villains, and all sorts of stuff. But they did. So I think that the ability of various sections of folks, no matter where they come from, to actually grasp complexity is underestimated. I think that we have to give people the opportunity to deal with complexity in one way or the other. And in coming to things like math and all, I don't see any reason why you can't have different grades of math after class 8 or class 9. Everybody doesn't have to know to solve a differential equation, but they can go to the math that they are comfortable with, and they will feel good about it. And why should math learning stop for? Why should somebody in the with the whatever the PCM or PCB not do some course, one other course, and still enjoy it? Geography was something that I think everybody enjoyed in school. And actually, like Gautam was talking about the chemistry teacher, we had a remarkable Mrs. Krishnamurti was a geography teacher who's really was. I think that in terms of geography is one place, one I think subject that can bring together so many disciplines, and I think that opportunities are there. We just need to find a way of putting it all in one place. And I think that's where we are sometimes not able to do that. Find the how do we do that in 2, 3, 4 years with a bunch of kids or folks? Um, you know, I think that's the actual practice of it, the mechanics of it. We are not getting it right.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah, no, we're way out of time, but yes.
Since we are way out of time, one or two more minutes won't matter, says Neha. But I think I just wanted to add a very small point, I think, to your question about a curriculum and what to think about here. And to build on what Jahnavi's already said, I think one of the most important things that I've learned as a teacher and is to instill a sense of power in students, that they can continue learning and that they can learn by themselves. There are some students who have that and they're able to learn, continuously later, etc. But there are many who don't have that sense of confidence, or really actually believe that I've studied this and therefore this is the only thing that I can do. And so I really, in some ways, I want to also talk to the two of you who showed real sort of frustration, I think, at this thought of being boxed in a certain way, to actually say that these are imaginary boundaries. I mean, in a sense, they're real because it does determine the work you're given in the beginning. But there are so many ways that you can continue learning and that you can insist on, doing other things. And I've seen countless examples of this. So I think this power to give, but how to do it is really, and one of the best ways I found is really to do an independent project. So I think a form of a thesis or some kind of, but where each person can choose a topic that they want to choose and that they want to pursue it for a certain length of time. They get some mentorship, some guidance, but then they own it. And the kind of learning just in the master's thesis has been just remarkable. And those students who literally, who have not, have really, I mean, I would say probably 80% of students find themselves in a certain way by doing this kind of an independent project, regardless of the degree or, the subject or whatever, because their topic, enables them to, explore and deal with the many dimensions of that topic that they choose. So anyway, just to say that, some of these things we're doing already, I think we just need to do them more and maybe to maybe better, because I do think that the degree of mentorship and various things matter. But yeah, just to.
Right. I know there are many, many more questions, but we are almost half an hour over time. So I don't want to keep anyone else from their dinners. Thank you all very much. Thank you very much for a really, really wonderful panel. And we'll continue tomorrow morning at 9:30. So see all of you here.